All right, thank you all very much for being here with us today. I'll just let you know I've been sending abstracts to this conference for 4 years now, but I finally got it. So this is my 20 minutes of fame, and I hope to make it worth everyone's while. So what we call the field of Ismaili studies started probably about 100 years ago, according to most opinions, in the early part of the 20th century. And since it started, there has been a great deal of progress in the study of the Ismailis. We have conferences, we have the Institute of Ismaili Studies, there are manuscripts, publications, and I actually I published a 2-part article, The Survey of Ismaili Studies in Religion Compass, a couple of years ago, where I reviewed the literature in a critical way, and that spurred some sort of higher level reflections on the field itself. So I am talking here today about Ismailism, but I'm talking about Ismailism as a scholarly category, Ismailism as the object of study in the field, and what that means and what that could mean. So we see this term, Ismailism, thrown around by many, many scholars. We see it qualified and used as if it's a genus of sorts. So we hear about the opening phase of Ismailism, we hear about Fatimid Ismailism, Nizari Ismailism, Tayyibi Ismailism, modern Ismailism. I myself am guilty of using this term in my own work, and I'll readily admit to that. However, I have observed a real ambiguity with regard to this term. Firstly, there are a diversity of phenomena throughout history called Ismaili. There are even ideas held by people who certainly did not believe in the Ismaili Imamat, but these ideas have still been described as Ismaili, and I'll expand on that later. What I have not seen is a critical, theoretical discussion about Ismailism. What is it? What sort of an intelligible entity are we talking about? And to put some perspective, we have seen lately a lot of critical discussion about Islam as an object of scholarly analysis, most recently with the late Shahab Ahmed's book, What is Islam? But I have not observed any discussion in the field of Ismaili studies about what it means for something to be Ismaili and what is Ismailism as a construct. And that becomes important because when you have scholars such as recently David Hollenberg arguing that Fatimid art and architecture is not Ismaili but pan-Alid or partisan Shia, this of course there are implicit ideas of what constitutes Ismaili versus what constitutes Shi'i. Once again, I'm speaking for analytical purposes. I'm not speaking from a normative sort of community perspective on what Ismailism is. So this is what I'll be talking about today, and I've decided to sort of trace the genealogy of the scholarly categories Ismaili and Ismailism. And although most works on the Ismailis will tell us that modern scholarship on Ismaili studies began in the 1930s with Ivanov, Suman Mukherjee, in his book released last year, has told us, and quite convincingly has said, that Ismaili studies now represents an epistemological entity in its own right, carving out as well as facilitating understanding of at once a Fatimid cultural past as well as a Muslim universality for the global Ismaili community. However, what is still glossed over, or to be charitable, only inadequately addressed in narratives tracing this new spate of scholarship, is the pertinence of the epistemic intervention that characterized the speech of the defense counsel of Aga Khan I in the 1866 Aga Khan case. So what exactly do we mean here? Well, as some people may know, the first Aga Khan, who is the 46th Imam of the Nizari Ismailis, he came to India in 1841, where there was a caste group known as the Khojas, who, for the most part, had recognized the Aga Khan and his ancestors as their spiritual masters. But they did this through their own indigenous vocabulary and symbols, which integrated Vaishnavi, Sant, Indo-Muslim Sufi, and Ismaili vocabulary. And the Khojas had what many scholars call a notion of fuzzy identity. You couldn't really say they're Hindu or they're Muslim. There was sort of an amalgamation of different identity symbols and practices. So a small group of these Khojas did not accept the Aga Khan's authority, and they filed suit against the Aga Khan in the Bombay High Court in 1866. And, their whole argument, the plaintiff argument, relied on a lot of Orientalist scholarship. It maligned the Ismailis and the Aga Khan as the arch heretics of Islam. And they claimed that the Khojas as a whole caste group were Sunni and they were not Ismaili. And it was in response to this where you had the Aga Khan's defense lawyer, Edward Irving Howard, who not only was trying to prove that the Khojas were Ismaili, but he had to take a long detour in his talk where it goes on for about 100 pages, where he actually, for the first time in Western literature, he takes the early Shi'is, the Fatimids, the Grand Masters of Alamut, and the Aga Khans and their ancestors, and the Khojas, and he puts them into one historical narrative. And if you read Howard's speech, which is online, you will actually find many of the issues he speaks to prefigure the issues that modern Ismaili studies scholars are dealing with. And these are some of the points. One thing that sort of got obscured here is there's a ton of analogies that Howard makes between Islam and Christianity. So Imam is compared to Pope, Protestant and Catholic are compared to Sunni and Shia, because he's trying to convince, an English judge about his point. And what's very interesting is this part of the speech where Howard actually says, and this is a monumental moment in the study of the Ismailis, where he basically says, I will not call them assassins. I will call them Ismaili and Bathani, on the grounds that this is a group that traces the Imamat through Ismail, son of Jafar Sadiq. So this is actually quite important, and I would sort of locate the, perhaps you could say, important origin point of modern Ismaili studies in Howard's defense speech, which takes place in a legal context, not an academic context. And now, in the actual case judgment of the Aga Khan case, you see the whole notion of who are the Ismailis and who are the Khojas being laid out in a sectarian framework on the analogy of Christianity. So the judge asked a whole bunch of questions, and then he provided answers to those questions. So already at the beginning, Sunni Muslims were described as orthodox, and the Shia were described as separatists. And the Shia are called a sect. And then the Ismailis are then qualified as a sect of the Shia, and the office of the Imamat is compared to the office of the Supreme Pontiff in Rome. And then the Aga Khan is situated as the Imam of the Nizari Ismailis. And finally, the Khojas are described as a sect of people who were Hindu and were converted to the faith of the Shia Imami Ismailis. So this construction, it may be from 1866, but it is still quite prevalent today. And the judgment and the way Ismailis were sort of defined in 1866 easily flowed into early 20th century scholarship on the Ismailis, where they are called a sect. Now the problem with being called a sect is that this is clearly from Max Weber's categorizations. And for him, sect and church should be contrasted. A sect is a sort of voluntary group of charismatic individuals, whereas a church is, the default, what everybody is born into. And there's been a lot of criticism about church-sect categories in the study of Islam. It seems like some were trying to use sect to talk about firqa, for example, but as Marshall Hodgson has noted in his Venture of Islam, they simply don't correspond. But what we do see here is in the early scholarship, and I've tried to cite some of it here for you, the Ismailis, or Ismailism, and I think Ivanov is the first to speak of Ismailism in English. He's also the only one to really critically inquire into what do we mean by Ismailism as a historical and analytical object. And here's a bit of a sample of some of what Ivanov is going through, and I've provided the year so you can see how his thought evolves. So first he says, Ismailism is some phenomenon that agrees in main tenets but differs in details. Then in 1942, he basically says the central ideal of Ismailism is this notion of the Imam and the authority of the Imam over everybody. Then, in 1963, Ivanov gets more sophisticated, and I still have trouble understanding this because I'm not an expert in organic chemistry, but he compares Ismailism to the so-called radical of organic chemistry. So something that contains 5 elements, and that these 5 elements are inseparable, and together they constitute Ismailism. And he compares the historical development of this, what he calls the Ismailism radical, to, you know, a egg, a caterpillar, a butterfly, sort of growing through history. And at the end here, he basically says that if one of these 5 elements are not present in a historical setting, it's basically because of an abnormality and or a heretical tendency. So what is happening here is, from a scholarly perspective, Ivanov has reified certain doctrines that he found Ismailis talking about or practicing, and he reified them into sort of a thing in and of itself called Ismailism. And apart from Ivanov, I have not seen later scholars, especially people like Farhad Daftari or Madelung, really sort of approach the issue from an analytical perspective. In fact, what I've been seeing is modern scholars on the whole have sort of accepted implicitly Ivanov's notion of Ismailism as this amalgamation of certain doctrines, and they've modified it a little bit. So for example, Aziz Ismail and Azim Danji in 1977, they here define Ismailism as a, quote, complex of attitudes toward truth and the fundamental questions about the nature of truth. And they resist what we see the Muslim heresiographers talking about, where they basically define the Ismailiya in terms of a succession dispute. So that's a sectarian definition, right? The idea that there's the succession to Muhammad, and then there's the succession to Jafar Sadiq, and then, you know, depending on what way the group follows, that's how they're defined. So Ismail and Nanji are trying to get away from that, and they're talking about a complex of attitudes, but they never actually tell us what those attitudes are. And it's a very vague definition, and when they actually write about Ismailism in that article, they seem to mirror the content that Ivanov gave to Ismailism. So I would call that a refinement of the definition. Then later on, we have Aziz Ismail in another book, where he finally cautions us about the use of the term Ismailism. He says, you know, there's no uniform body of doctrine here, but he says, apart from allegiance to the Ismaili Imamat. So what I've been able to see from the literature, for those who do talk about this, is that there are 2 implicitly prevailing definitions of Ismailism. One is what I call thick Ismailism, where Ismailism is defined through one or through more than one set of doctrines. And I've given some examples. So what Ivanov was doing with his organic chemistry analogy, that is what you could call thick Ismailism. Then there's something called what I call thin Ismailism, where Ismailism is simply defined as one essential feature: allegiance to and acceptance of the Ismaili Imamat, which is an essentialist definition that has sectarian lineage, as I show. So this is what I find in scholarship. So when people use the term Ismailism or Fatimid Ismailism or early Ismailism, it's based on one of these 2 conceptualizations. But once again, never explicitly defined. Now, I would like to propose on the next few minutes that there are problems with this. Once again, there are problems from an analytical perspective. If we're talking about Ismailism as a human historical phenomenon, there are no problems from a normative perspective. You know, communities can define themselves how they wish. So, keeping in mind the thin and the thick conceptualizations, and I've actually observed that the thin definition of Ismailism as allegiance to the Ismaili Imamat, it has become normative for certain communities. So in the Nizari Ismaili Muslim community today, they are often defining it in this one way, and that leads to some problems. So that would mean, if you're using thin Ismailism, it would mean that doctrines about Neoplatonic cosmology, Ta'wil, you know, parallel worlds and this sort that Ismaili writers were clearly invested in over time, it would mean that these are actually marginal to Ismailism itself, if Ismailism is defined primarily as allegiance to the Ismaili Imamat. The other problem, as Professor Walker has pointed out in his book, is that there is no uniform Ismaili doctrine of the Imam through history. In every century, Ismaili communities have conceived the Imam in different ways. So that thin definition is untenable from a historical perspective. The term Ismailia we've already heard. That term comes from, you know, doxography and heresiography of non-Ismaili Muslims writing about Ismailis. And what's very interesting is both the thin and thick notions of Ismailism don't exactly capture how Ismaili individuals and groups through history self-defined. So if you look at a sample of self-definitions, which I've put on the slide here, the term Ismaili doesn't even capture what these people stand for and what they're doing. Even when the community was forced to accept the term Ismaili, they expanded on what it means to be Ismaili, and it goes quite beyond succession disputes. For example, the Yemeni Dai Mutlaq Ali ibn Muhammad al-Walid, in his response to al-Ghazali, he accepts the name Ismaili, but he expands and goes on to talk about how that means that they're following the path of truth, that they cling to the walaya of the Imam, that they are ascending from rank to rank. So the term is accepted, but then it's expanded upon way beyond what the term means. We also have cases, what I call boundary cases, where there are Ismaili phenomenon or ideas held by people who don't accept the Ismaili Imamat, but scholars have called their ideas, or sometimes the individual or group, Ismaili. The Ikhwan Safa are a key point. Are they Ismaili or are they not Ismaili? Well, Netten says no, they're not. They don't give prominence to the Imamat. But Michael Epstein says yes, they are. Their cosmology, prophecy, notion of parallel worlds, this is Ismaili. Abdel Karim Shahrastani, is he Sunni or Ismaili? Well, what's interesting is that when the first argument was made for Shahrastani being Ismaili, it was based on his refutation of Ibn Sina, and that refutation doesn't talk about the Imamat. It was on the basis of Shahrastani's apophatic theology and his cosmology that it was argued that he's Ismaili, which means you can have non-Imamat ideas that merit the category Ismaili. Maimonides, some have called his ideas Ismaili. Alfred Ivory has observed that there's a whole pattern of sympathy that Maimonides harbors towards Ismaili methodology. Now, Maimonides did not believe in the Fatimid Ismaili Imam, but that doesn't prevent some of his doctrines from being termed or labeled as Ismaili in a meaningful sense. There's this phenomenon called Jewish Ismailism in the Rabbi Nathanael ben al-Fayoumi. Once again, doesn't believe in the Imamat, but his cosmology of 10 intellects, his radical apophatic theology, has been called validly Ismaili. And then there even this case of Ismaili cosmologies in Sunni thought. Ghazali, so I showed in an article published earlier this year that Ghazali's cosmology in the Mishkat al-Anwar is an appropriation of Ismaili Neoplatonic cosmology. Now, Ghazali didn't believe in the Imam, but you know, some of his ideas can validly be called Ismaili. So there's a tension here where none of this would be meaningful if you accept the thick or the thin concepts of Ismailism that I showed you earlier. But these are being called Ismaili. So what this leads to is the need to radically reconceptualize in a conscious way the category Ismaili and Ismailism. Here's one possible way to do it, and I haven't actually done this. This is just a map. So what I've argued so far, what I've shown so far about how Ismailism is being defined by scholars, implicitly or explicitly, that is what the result of what Jonathan Z. Smith calls a monothetic taxonomy. Monothetic means you look for one or more features in the phenomenon, and if it has that one feature, it has all the 5 that you're looking for, then it fits into the category. And if it doesn't have those features, it's out. That's monothetic, and this is an essentialist way of categorizing, religious or other phenomena. So that would mean you would ask, is it Shia or Sunni? Shia, okay. Is it Twelver or Ismaili? Ismaili, okay. Is it Ismaili, is it Nizari or Taibi? That's monothetic, right? One feature determines where the phenomenon is categorized. However, Jonathan Z. Smith and Carl Ernst have argued that we can also classify things in a polythetic way, where the class, in this case Ismailism, is defined as a set of properties that are separable, that don't all have to be present in a phenomenon to merit the classification Ismaili. So it would look something like this. If you go through different examples, these are several features that you could say are part of Ismailism in a polythetic way. And some phenomena will have all these features, some will have one or two, some will have half of them. And what that allows one to do in a meaningful way is it allows you to take many of these historical examples of what have been called Ismaili phenomena and meaningfully call them Ismaili if they possess, a certain number of these properties, but they don't have to have all of them. So if, Al-Ghazali's cosmology has, 2, 3, or 4 of the features in the category here, then one can meaningfully call that particular cosmology Ismaili or Ismaili influenced. Without Ghazali actually, having to accept the Ismaili Imamat, right? And once again, what I'm trying to say is, in a sense, what I'm talking about, it's already been done implicitly. Like when scholars classify Al-Fayyumi's thought as Jewish Ismailism, when somebody calls Maimonides' idea of prophecy an Ismaili idea, and so on and so forth, they're already sort of doing this, but none of this has been done consciously. So this is sort of a proposal for analytical purposes on how we can get a better sense of the concept and construction of Ismailism in scholarship. Thank you very much.